Hello, brothers and sisters. This is Blake. Today I wanted to go a little bit more in depth with you on the law of consecration and stewardship. My first couple of videos just kind of explained some of the basics and gave you a general framework of how the law operates. And in this video, I want to go over some terms, some definitions, as well as some additional teachings from prophets and apostles and from the Doctrine and Covenants pertaining to the law of consecration and stewardship. This is going to cover a lot of different topics. It's kind of a smorgasbord of information. So I'll jump from one topic to the next. There's not really a clear linear pattern I'm going to follow in this presentation. So first, we know that the law of consecration requires that we recognize that everything is the Lord's. And it acknowledges this in D&C 104, 54 to 57. And again, a commandment I give unto you concerning your stewardship, which I have appointed unto you. Behold, all these properties are mine, or else your faith is vain, and ye are found hypocrites. And the covenants which ye have made unto me are broken. And if the properties are mine, then ye are stewards. Otherwise ye are no stewards. But verily I say unto you, I have appointed unto you to be stewards over mine house, even stewards indeed. Now, who's required to live the law of consecration? In D&C 70 verse 10, behold, none are exempt from this law who belong to the church of the living God. So this scriptural doctrine has not changed in the church, and so all of us as members of this church, including the prophets and apostles, are duty bound to live this law. One of the main purposes we saw in the law of consecration was assisting the poor and the needy, right? And this is confirmed in D&C 42, 31 to 32. And inasmuch as ye impart of your substance unto the poor, ye will do it unto me, and they shall be laid before the bishop of my church, and his counselors, 2 of the elders or high priests, such as he shall appoint or has appointed, and set apart for that purpose. And it shall come to pass that after they are laid before the bishop of my church, and after that he has received these testimonies concerning the consecration of the properties of my church, that they cannot be taken from the church. Okay, so that which is given to the church to assist the poor and the needy cannot then be taken back from the church. So we can clearly see this, right, in today's church. Once you donate something to the church, whether it's a fast offering, whether it's tithing, whether it's humanitarian aid, what have you, that cannot be taken from the church. That then belongs to the church as a whole. And more so, it belongs to the Lord. And the law of consecration and stewardship is the foundation upon which a Zion society is built, and upon which we know that there is no poor among them. I want to talk a little bit more about this disputes about needs and wants. I talked about it a little bit more in my other video. Kind of basically there needed to be checks and balances in a sense, where the bishop wasn't the ultimate power or the ultimate say, and neither was the individual or the family. This is also part of that quote I didn't include in my first presentation, but it's part of the same statement that Joseph Smith made. He said, therefore, those persons consecrating property to the bishop in Zion and then receiving an inheritance back must reasonably show to the bishop that they need as much as they claim. But in case the two parties cannot come to a mutual agreement, the bishop is to have nothing to do about receiving such consecrations. And the case must be laid before a council of 12 high priests, the bishop not being one of the council, but he is to lay the case before them. Okay, so if there's this dispute, then a council of 12 high priests will consider the matter and decide the matter. And to ensure that it's a fair decision and a not impartial decision, the bishop is not part of that council. Now I wanted to go through and define what the scriptures term the residue. And this is found in D&C 42, 34 to 36. Therefore, the residue shall be kept in my storehouse to administer to the poor and the needy, as shall be appointed by the high council of the church and the bishop and his council, and for the purpose of purchasing lands for the public benefit of the church, and building houses of worship, and building up of the New Jerusalem, which is hereafter to be revealed, that my covenant people may be gathered in one in that day when I shall come to my temple. And this I do for the salvation of my people. And then President J. Reuben Clark, in an April 1942 General Conference address, said, that part of a man's property which was not turned back to him, so after this initial consecration to the church, that part which was not turned back to him or given back to him, if he had more than was needed under this rule of equality, became the common property of the church, and that common property was used for the support of the poor of the church. It is spoken of in the Revelations as the residue of property. Okay, so after the person's consecrated, anything that's above and beyond that they have that they're consecrating for their needs and their wants, that's termed the residue. Okay, now there's a separate term entitled the surplus. This is a little bit different, and this is found in D&C 82:18. And all this for the benefit of the church of the living God, that every man may improve upon his talent, that every man may gain other talents, yea, even an hundredfold, to be cast into the Lord's storehouse, to become the common property of the whole church. So the surplus is that which is gained by improvements upon an inheritance or an improvement upon a stewardship. Okay? And that also is consecrated to the church, recognized as the Lord's, and it becomes the common property of the church. And it's no longer recognized as the private property of that individual. The other important thing to understand with the surplus is that once that part is given, that improvement or that surplus, a person does not receive that property back if they break their covenant. So just like before, whenever we're consecrating, right, there's once we give it to the church, there's no getting it back for us. And this is confirmed in D&C 42:32. And it shall come to pass that after they are laid before the bishop of my church, and after that he has received these testimonies concerning the consecration of the properties of my church, that they cannot be taken from the church. And both Marion G. Romney and President J. Reuben Clark taught more about the surplus. Elder Romney said, so long as he remained in the order, he consecrated to the church the surplus he produced above the needs and wants of his own family. This surplus went into a storehouse from which stewardships were given to others, and from which the needs of the poor were supplied. And then President Clark said that whatever a steward realized from the portion allotted to him, over and above that which was necessary in order to keep his family under the standard provided, was turned over by the steward to the bishop. And this amount of surplus went into a bishop's storehouse. Now, how do residues and surpluses work today in the church? Because we don't really see this, this formal giving of inheritances. This is what President J. Reuben Clark said. He said, in lieu of residues and surpluses, which were accumulated and built up under the United Order, we today have our fast offerings, our welfare donations, and our tithing, all of which may be devoted to the care of the poor, as well as for the carrying on of the activities and business of the church. Okay, now this next part is something that when I made my video last time, I didn't quite understand the formal process of how this worked. I've had legal training. I went to law school, and so my mind tends to go to already what I know, right? So this idea of a covenant and a deed accompanying consecration, it's something that's just a little bit different than we kind of think of in our normal concept of real property or deeds or contracts. So I'll go through the revelations and statements by the prophets to kind of explain this requirement. First of all, in D&C 42:30, it says, "And behold, thou wilt remember the poor, and consecrate of thy properties for their support, that which thou hast to impart unto them, with a covenant and a deed which cannot be broken." Elder Romney, Marion G. Romney, said that to enter the United Order, one consecrated all his possessions to the church by a covenant and a deed which could not be broken. That is, he completely divested himself of all his property by conveying it to the church. And then this is what President J. Reuben Clark said. And remember that President Clark was a lawyer by trade, so he's obviously very knowledgeable about how this operates legally. He says, "Under the United Order, every man was called to consecrate to the church all of the property which he had. The real estate was to be conveyed to the church, as I understand the revelations, by what we would call a deed in fee simple." So there's a physical deed, if you've got real property, land, that's given to the church. There's a deed created there. And then the man's property became the absolute property of the church at that point. Then the bishop would deed back to the donor by that same kind of deed, a fee simple deed, and then also transfer to him by an equivalent instrument or an equivalent document or contract, so far as personal property was concerned. And he would deed that amount of real and personal property, the two being taken together, that was required by the individual for the support of himself and his family, according to his circumstances and his wants and needs. And this the man held as his own property. So in my original presentation, I kind of just assumed there wasn't any formal deed that would be created in that initial consecration to the church. I just figured the church would, have some sort of a contract or instrument that would show, okay, this property is this person's, right? But it was acknowledged still to be the Lord's property. But in this case, President Clark's teaching, no, there is a formal deed or contract that's written that transfers that property to the church. And then after determining all the needs and wants, then it's either deeded back or other properties deeded back to them, or there's some sort of an instrument or a contract or document that shows this is that person's individual private property. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, now let's talk about the terms portion, stewardship, and inheritance. That's what President Clark said. He said, "The land which you received from the bishop by deed, whether it was part of the land which you yourself had deeded to the church, or whether it came as an outright gift from the church, and the personal property which you received, were all together sometimes called a portion, sometimes a stewardship, and sometimes an inheritance." So all three of those terms basically mean the same thing. It's all that property that you receive back from the church to provide for your needs and your wants. And then this principle of a stewardship being given by a deed is confirmed both in the Doctrine and Covenants as well as by Elder Romney. In D&C 51:4 it says, "Let my servant, Edward Partridge," who was the bishop at that time, "when he shall appoint a man his portion, or his stewardship, or his inheritance, give unto him a writing that shall secure unto him his portion, that he shall hold it, even this right and this inheritance in the church." And the reason this is done, why this deed is given, is because it protects individuals if they are disqualified from participating as stewards. For legal purposes, the stewardship, it was private property, even though the stewards themselves realized that the property ultimately and actually belonged to God. And Elder Romney taught that each man owned his portion or inheritance or stewardship with an absolute title, which at his option, he could alienate. So alienate means he could transfer. He could keep and operate, or otherwise treat as his own. So it was then that person's own property. And that was something I talked about in my second video, where I talked about how Satan is trying to attack personal and private property rights. And we see that as kind of going directly against what the Lord has taught and what he's revealed, especially here in his law of consecration. Now let's talk further about these stewards that end up breaking the covenant or who are not worthy to be stewards. This is discussed in D&C 51:5. And if he shall transgress and is not accounted worthy to belong to the church, he shall not have power to claim that portion which he has consecrated unto the bishop for the poor and needy of my church. Therefore he shall not retain the gift, but shall only have claim on that portion that is deeded unto him. Okay, so this is important to understand. The person, when they're excommunicated or when they leave the church, they forfeit their residue and their surplus property, because that's already been given to the church. It's become the common property of the church. Therefore, it's not considered their own private property. And today we can see exactly how this operates, right? When a person leaves the church or when they're excommunicated, they don't receive any of their donations that they made, and they don't receive any of their tithing back. Now, what about that inheritance or portion that he retained and which was considered his own personal property? What happens to that? Well, according to this scripture, he retains that property. And I think this is probably the thing that caused most of the problems back when this law was revealed in the early days of the church. Because there actually were people that left the church, and then they did want to take those things that had been given to them, and they wanted to take back whatever they had given to the church as well. And so that's why the Lord revealed these specific guidelines on how that was to be administered. Now, a lot of people may still shudder at the fact that, hey, whatever this person was given and is their personal property, if they just go and take that, that kind of seems unfair, right? Because they've kind of left the system, so it seems like they should have to forfeit that. But remember, agency and the recognition of private property, those are the fundamental principles that need to be obeyed. And just because a person loses, their spiritual standing in the church, does not necessarily mean that they lose that right to their personal or private property. Okay, another thing to emphasize is that the church property is not communal property. And this is it's from a pamphlet of articles that were written by President Clark in the Deseret News in 1942. And he says, the church never was, and under existing commandments never will be, a communal society, under the directions thus far given by the Lord. The United Order was not communal nor communistic. It was completely and intensely individualistic, with a consecration of unneeded surpluses for the support of the church and the poor. Okay, so communal living is where everybody has right to access and right to use property. Okay, so let's say you were given a stewardship of land. Under the law of consecration, you are the one that holds the supreme right to control how that property is handled, used, whatever, right? Under the ideas of communism or communalism, even though you are on that, other people could come on and they could also do whatever they want with that property. So an example I've heard given is, let's say you have a house, right? In communalism, somebody could come in and let's say they didn't like what color your house was. Well, they could come in and they could paint that a different color, right? They would have the same amount of a right to do what they wanted with that property as you would. And you can kind of see where this is creating a lot of problems. this isn't what the law of consecration is. The law of consecration recognizes individual property rights and the individual's right, exclusive right, to control how that property is used. So this church property, again, that's held by the church in the bishop's storehouse. This isn't everybody gets to decide and take from it as they need, right? No, there's still a process. The bishop still, if there is a need that arises where somebody's stewardship does not fulfill their wants and their needs, they go through the bishop, and then that bishop works with them to determine if there are additional resources that can come from the church property for that person or family. Okay? But it's not like anybody's right can come in and just take what they need, right? They can't just, say, oh, I need this right now or whatever. There's a standard process that needs to be followed. And if you think about how a bishop's storehouse is handled, right? In order to be able to access, like the food in the bishop's storehouse, you have to have a food recommendation, typically from the Relief Society president and from the bishop, saying that you're authorized to go for whatever amount that you determine with the Relief Society president and the bishop, and that's what you're allotted, or that's what you're allowed. Okay, so in that way, the church property is still regulated, and it's not a free-for-all, basically. And President Clark emphasized this as well. He said it was not contemplated that the church should own everything, or that we should become in the church, with reference to our property and otherwise, the same kind of automaton mannequin that communism makes out of the individual, with the state standing at the head in place of the church. Okay? So the church, again, is not going to be the owner of all the property, right? Once it's deeded back to you, it is your property. It's no longer the church's. There is still that recognition, though, that it's the Lord's, and that if the Lord requires you to consecrate whatever property, that you would do that. But it's done still within the constraints of ensuring that all the needs and wants of every family and person are provided for, so that there's no poor among them. Okay, a couple other small terms that were used in the past in the scriptures. The first one is the sacred treasury. This is how President Clark defined that. He says, the sacred treasury is that into which was put the avails of the sacred things in the treasury for sacred and holy purposes. While it is not clear, it would seem that into this treasury were to be put the surpluses which were derived from the publication of the Revelations, so the Book of Mormon, Pearl of Great Price, and other similar things. And the stewardship, the person that was over that, was to be given to Joseph and to others that he designated. So we can actually find the revelation and how this treasury, sacred treasury, was to operate in D&C 104, 60 to 66. Now there's another treasury called another treasury, funny enough, and into that other treasury went the general revenues which came to the church, such as, gifts of money, and those revenues that were derived from improvements of stewardships, as distinguished from the residues of the original consecrations and the surpluses which came from the operation of their stewardships. So that's what went into this other treasury. And the revelation on this and how it was supposed to run and be administered is in D&C 72, 11 through 14. Now, where do we see these today in the church? This is what President Clark said. He says, we have in place of the two treasuries, the sacred treasury and another treasury, the general funds of the church. Okay, so that's what they're known as today. Okay, now the big question, the law of consecration, when is it going to be fully implemented? D&C 105:34. And let those commandments which I have given concerning Zion and her law be executed and fulfilled after her redemption. So the united order and its attendant laws, the law of consecration and stewardship, are not going to be fully realized until after the redemption of Zion, or the New Jerusalem. In the meaning in which the Lord was using the term Zion, the redemption means the reestablishment of the people in Missouri. And as of 1945, President Clark said this has not yet been accomplished. Okay, so once the redemption of Zion happens, after that is when the law of consecration and stewardship will be fully implemented. Now, what about, we know that this is when it's going to start, right? But is the law of consecration and stewardship going to be something that's only lived in the New Jerusalem or in Zion? This is what President Lorenzo Snow said about that. He said, "Now here is one of the first principles of the United Order, and it was made and ordained a law by every person, and everyone was required to observe it who should be privileged to go to the land of Missouri to receive an inheritance. But this, I think, will apply not only to those who should go to the land of Missouri, but to the people of God in every land. Wherever there is a people of God, the principles of the United Order are applicable, if they would receive and obey them. Some have thought that the United Order was to be kept only by the people who should go up to the land of Missouri. Now, this, I believe, is incorrect. It would seem very singular that the Latter-day Saints, when they receive the gospel, should not have the privilege of uniting themselves according to the principles of the celestial law, and that Jackson County should be the only place where this law might be observed." Okay, so it's not only going to be lived in the New Jerusalem, it's going to be lived by the saints of God everywhere. And in closing, I just want to reiterate the principle that I did discuss in my last video about how we truly need to live, and we can live, and we've been commanded to live the law of consecration right now. This is what Elder Romney said. "Full implementation of the United Order must, according to the revelation, await the redemption of Zion. In the meantime, while we are being more perfectly taught and are gaining experience, we should be strictly living the principles of the United Order insofar as they are embodied in present church requirements, such as tithing, fast offerings, welfare projects, storehouses, and other principles and practices. Through these programs, we should, as individuals, implement in our own lives the bases of the United Order." So, brothers and sisters, I'd encourage all of you, seek the Spirit to find out how you can live the law of consecration here and now. We do not have to wait for the redemption of Zion to begin living these principles. We can begin living them right now. And I bear testimony that these things are true, and that this is a divinely established law and a divinely established order. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.